In this video, you are going to create an API route for fetching an individual to-do. Now, most of this video is going to be a challenge, but there is one thing I want to show you before we get started, and that is how to fetch a variable that's passed in via the URL. Now, as I mentioned, the structure for this URL is going to be a GET request, 2/ to-dos. Then we're going to dive into the to-dos, fetching an individual item where the ID gets passed like this. This means that we need to make this part of the URL dynamic. I want to be able to fetch that value, whatever a user happens to pass in, and use it to make the query that we set up in Mongoose queries, like this one, to fetch the to-do by ID. Now, in order to get that done, let's go ahead and call app.get, passing in the URL. The first part we already know, /todos/, but now what we need is a URL parameter. URL parameters follow this pattern. It's a colon followed by a name. Now I could call this to-do ID or anything else, but what we're going to call it for this section is :ID. This is going to create an ID variable. It's going to be on the request object, the one we'll set up in just a moment, and we'll be able to access that variable. That means when someone makes this request, this callback will fire, the one we're going to specify now, and we'll be able to query by that ID they pass in. Now we are still going to get the request and response object. The only difference is we're now going to be using something off of request. This one is request.params. Request.params is going to be an object. It's going to have key value pairs where the key is the URL parameter like ID and the value is whatever value was actually put here. In order to demonstrate this, I am going to simply call response.send, sending back the request params object. This is going to let us test out this route inside of Postman and see exactly how it works. Over inside of the terminal, I can start up our server. I'm going to use nodemon server /server.js to start things up. Now the server's on localhost 3000 and we can make a GET request to this URL. Over inside of Postman, I'm going to do just that. We have the GET method. The URL is localhost. And it's still on port 3000 /todos/, and then we can type whatever we like. For example, 123. Now, when I send this off, what we get back is that request params object. And right here, you can see it has an ID property set to 123. That means we are able to access the value here using request.params.id. And that is exactly what you're going to need to do for the challenge. Over inside of Atom, I'll start things off by creating that variable, a var ID set equal to request.params.id. With this in place, you now know everything you need in order to complete the challenge, which is going to be to finish filling out this route. First up, you're going to validate the ID using that object ID is valid method we explored over in the Mongoose queries file up above. I'll leave a little comment here. Validate ID using is valid. Now, if it's not valid, what you're going to do is stop the function execution and you're going to respond with a 404. Because the ID passed in is not valid, there's no way it's ever going to be in the collection. We're going to respond with a 404, letting the user know that the to-do was not found. And you can send back an empty body, which means you can just call send without passing in any value. It would be similar to this statement with no error here. And you would also change this from a 400 to a 404. Now, after that, you're going to start querying the database, and this is going to happen using find by ID. I want you to take this ID and query the to-dos collection looking for a matching document. And there's two ways this could go. There's the success case, and there is the error case. If we get an error, that one is pretty self-explanatory. All we're going to do is send back a 400, letting the user know that the request was not valid. And we're also going to go ahead and send back nothing. We're not going to be sending back that error argument because the error that prints for this error message, it could contain private information. Now we're going to be beefing out our error handling later. Currently, as you can see, we have the function duplicated in quite a few places. That'll get moved into one location later, but for now, you can respond with a 400 and send empty body back. This brings us to the success case. Now, if there is a to-do, if to-do, you're going to go ahead and send it back. If there is no to-do, if no to-do, this means the call did succeed, but the ID was not found in the collection. All you're going to do is go ahead and send back a 404 with an empty body. Now, both of these statements are going to look really similar. You're sending back a 404, letting the user know that the ID they passed in does not match any ID of a document in the to-dos collection. Now, you know how to do all of this. You can use anything you need to get this done. That means you can use the Mongoose queries file. You can use the mongoosejs.com documentation. You can use Stack Overflow, Google, or anything else. It's not about memorizing exactly how to get stuff done. It's about working through those problems on your own. Eventually, you will memorize a lot of these techniques as they come up again and again, but for now, your goal is to just get it working. When you're done, go ahead and fire off this request over in the Postman application. That means you're going to want to grab an ID that is valid from RoboMongo and paste it right here. You can also test what happens with IDs that are valid but don't exist in the database and IDs that are invalid like 123, which is not a valid object ID. With this in place, you are ready to start the challenge. Take a moment to pause the video, fill this out, test it, make sure it works, and when you're done, go ahead and click play. How'd you do on this one? This was by far the biggest challenge I've given you, but that's the goal. The goal is to start giving you more work to do on your own because that's where the real learning happens. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is fill out the code for these comments right here. We're going to validate the ID, and we're going to send back a 404 if it's not valid. Now, up at the very top of the file, I do not have object ID imported, so I'm going to have to go ahead and do that. Just below body parser, I can create a variable, object ID, uppercase I, uppercase D, and set that equal to the return result from require, and we're requiring the MongoDB library. Now that we have object ID in place, we can go ahead and use it down below. Right here, we'll write an if statement, if object ID.isValid. Now, obviously, we only want to run this code if it's not valid, so I'm going to flip the return result using an exclamation mark, and then I'm going to pass the ID in. Now we have an if condition that's only going to pass if the ID, the one that got passed in as the URL parameter, was not valid. In that case, we're going to use return to prevent function execution. Then I'm going to go ahead and respond using response.status, setting it equal to a 404, and I'm going to call send with no arguments so I can send back an empty body. And there we go. Our first thing is complete. With this in place, we can now go ahead and move down below, creating the query. At this point, we actually do have something we can test. We can pass in invalid IDs and make sure we get that 404 back. Over inside of the terminal, I ran the application using nodemon, so it automatically restarted. In Postman, I can rerun this request, and right here we get our 404, which is fantastic. This is not a valid object ID, the condition failed, and the 404 was indeed returned. Next up, we're going to make that query to do dot find by ID. Here, we're going to pass in the ID, which we have in the ID variable, and then we're going to attach our success and error handlers. Dot then, passing in our success callback. This is going to get called potentially with the individual to-do document, and I am going to call catch as well, getting the error, and we can do the error handler first. If there is an error, we're going to keep things really simple. Response.status, setting it equal to a 400. Then we're going to go ahead and call send, leaving out the error object intentionally. With this in place, the only thing left to do is fill out the success handler. Now, the first thing we need to do is make sure that a to-do is actually found. This query, if successful, might not always result in an actual document being returned. Right here, I'm going to use an if statement to check if there is no to-do. If there is no to-do, we want to respond with a 404, just like we did up above. We're going to return to stop the function execution, response.status. The status here will be 404, and we will be using send to respond with no data. Perfect. Now that we have this case in place, the last case is the happy path, the success case, when everything goes as planned. The ID is valid, and we find a document in the to-dos collection that has an ID matching the ID passed in. In that case, all we're going to do is respond using response.send, sending back the to-do. Now, you could have sent it in like this. This will indeed work, but what I want to do is tweak it just a little bit. Instead of sending back to-do as the body, I'm going to send back an object where the to-do is attached as the to-do property using the ES6 object definition, which is identical to this. This gives me a little flexibility down the line. I could always add other properties onto the response, like custom status codes or anything else. It's similar to the technique we used up above for get to-dos. Right here, instead of responding with the array, we responded with an object that has a to-dos property, and that is the array. Now that we have this in place, we are done and we can test things out. I'm going to save the file, remove all of our comments, add a semicolon where needed, and we're going to grab an ID from RoboMongo. Over inside of RoboMongo, I can grab an ID for one of my to-dos. I'm going to go with the second one. I'll edit the document and copy it to the clipboard. Now over in Postman, we can go ahead and make the request, setting the ID equal to the ID value we just copied. I'm going to send it off, and what do we get? We get our object where we have a to-do property. And on that to-do property, we have all of the properties for the document: ID, text, completed at, and completed. Now, the last case I want to test is what happens when we request a to-do with a valid object ID, but one that just happens to not exist. I'm going to do this by taking the last number in my ID and replacing it from 9 to 0. If I send this off, we get our 404, which is fantastic. This is exactly what I expect to happen when I make a request for a to-do. The object ID is valid, it's just not in the collection. Now that we've made this request, we can actually save this inside of our to-do app collection. So later down the line, it's a lot easier to fire off this one. I'm going to save it using save as. We can leave the description empty and we can change the name to get/todos/:ID. And I am going to add it to our existing collection, the to-do app collection. Now we have 3 routes. The only thing left to do for this route is to add some test cases, and that's going to be the topic of the next video. To wrap this one up, let's commit our changes and push them up to GitHub. I'm going to shut down the server and run git status. Here we see we have our modified file. This means I can run git commit with the A flag and the M flag, and then I'm going to provide my commit message. Now, if you're using the A flag and the M flag, you can actually use a shortcut, the AM flag, which does the exact same thing. It's going to add all of our modified files to the commit. It's also going to give us a place to add a message. A good message for this one would be add get to-dos ID. Excellent. With this in place, I'm going to make the commit, push it up to GitHub, and we are done. I will see you next time, where we are going to go ahead and write test cases for this route. It's going to be mostly a challenge like this one was, so get ready for it. Stay tuned. I will see you then.